Well, welcome back, everybody. It is so great to have you with us. We've had wonderful attendance all day and fantastic panelists. Very, very interesting conversation. This afternoon, we're actually going to start our afternoon with looking at the idea of curation and collections. And I'm just going to say a few words and then say a little bit about our panelists, who are quite fantastic. And then I'll begin with a little bit of background on the Norman Rockwell Museum's collections, which is why I have this slide up. But I hope you had a good break. I hope you enjoyed, if you had a chance to look at them, some of the famous Artist School videos that were part of a film collection that came to us from Magdalene and Robert Livesey, looking at the Venerable Art Correspondence course and the artwork and lessons that were created by 12 famous illustrators, including Norman Rockwell, to help people think about the possibility that art might be a viable career or certainly a good hobby. This afternoon, my fellow panelists and I will offer a glimpse into the illustration collections and resources at the Norman Rockwell Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Maurice Sendak Foundation and University of Connecticut Library, and the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. The ability to acquire, process, and provide physical and virtual access to this expansive body of materials, which have reflected and shaped popular culture, our organizations seek to examine the nature of published images and their integral presence as artistic and cultural artifacts. It's my pleasure now to introduce my fellow panelists, and then I'll just begin with a few words about the Norman Rockwell Museum Art and Archival Collection. So when I mention you, if you would wave, that would be great, and then hopefully everybody will be able to see you. Kim Conaty is the Stephen and Anne Ames Curator of Drawings and Prints at the Whitney Museum of American Art. She curated the 2018 exhibition Mary Course, A Survey in Light, and is currently organizing an exhibition on Edward Hopper, among other projects. In addition to her work on exhibitions and acquisitions, she co-directs the Whitney's strategic plan for the collection and oversees the Sandra Gilman Works on Paper Study Center. Farris Wahbeh is the Benjamin and Irma Weiss Director of Research Resources at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Before joining the Whitney, he was a project archivist in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University and has had roles at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art in Chicago, excuse me, Special Collections of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Getty Research Institute. Jonathan Weinberg is an artist, art historian, and curator of the Maurice Sendak Foundation, and teaches at the Yale School of Art and the Rhode Island School of Design. His most recent book is Peer Groups, Art and Sex Along the New York Waterfront, and he is the lead curator for the touring exhibition Art After Stonewall, 1969 to 89. His art has been included in exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Yale Art Gallery, the Rhode Island School of Design, and others. Clara Nguyen, and Clara, I hope you will correct my pronunciation of your name, is the project archivist for the Maurice Sendak collection at the University of Connecticut. She's responsible for all activities related to the Maurice Sendak collection, from integrating the collection into the UCONN archives and libraries management and access systems, to developing ideas for outreach and educational uses of the collection, to preparing, mounting, and documenting exhibitions. And last but certainly not least is Laura Fravel, who I'm thrilled could join us at short notice. Thank you, Laura. Is the curatorial research assistant for American Art in the Drawings, Prints, and Graphic Design Department at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Previously, she was the exhibition assistant for American watercolor in the Age of Homer and Sargent at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and she has held curatorial positions and fellowships at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, North Carolina Museum of Art, and the Ackland Art Museum. Thank you all of our panelists for being with us today. Really great to have you. Beyond the legendary status that he had achieved some 40 years before his death in 1978, illustrator Norman Rockwell was a masterful painter and a complex man. His impact on 20th century popular culture and influence on generations of American illustrators cannot be overstated. A spiritual descendant of such illustrator storytellers as Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth, he set the standard for commercial artists who use narrative realism to illustrate books, magazines, and advertisements from the 1920s to the 1950s. A seminal figure in the evolutionary process of published imagery, he was also a catalyst for change for a younger generation of post-war illustrators and designers who embraced dissonance and a more abstract modernist aesthetic, literally rebelling against Rockwell. As we know, all aspects of the marketplace for illustration have undergone major change since his time, reflecting the evolution of culture, commerce, and technology. But his artistic output represents a significant moment in the continuum of popular art in America, providing links to a vast, diverse group of visual communicators, past and present, whom we strive to represent and reconsider in broader cultural contexts through museum exhibitions and its art and archival collections. Of the 852 original Norman Rockwell artworks in our collection today, the first 189 were placed in the museum's care in perpetuity by Rockwell himself in 1973 for the purpose of art education and appreciation. 2 years before his death in 1976, he amended his will to leave his studio and its expansive contents to the museum, including artworks, reference photographs, such as the ones you see here, and correspondence, first uses of his art, props, and personal documents. Many of Rockwell's most iconic images are in the Norman Rockwell Museum Art Collection Trust, including Triple Self-Portrait, Girl at Mirror, The Runaway, Marriage License, and The Four Freedoms. And you're seeing freedom of speech here, created in 1943, and I thought it might be interesting for you to see one of the many updates that has been created more recently in 2018 by Hank Willis Thomas. The Norman Rockwell Museum collection was started in 1975 with the purchase of The Problem We All Live With, Rockwell's most iconic civil rights era statement. This collection has been developed through purchase, gift, and bequest. The collection includes notable magazine covers and story illustrations, such as Art Critic and Girl Reading the Post. And through this collection, all phases of Rockwell's career, his artistic and technical progression, and the history of the era can be studied. Since then, the museum has acquired many significant gifts of art by illustrators who've inspired Rockwell, worked as his contemporaries, and carried his profession forward in time. Now numbering approximately 21,000 originals by other artists, and in fact by more than 300 creators. These include artworks by Rockwell's mentors, J.C. Leyendecker, George Bridgman, the great anatomist who helped to shape his early vision, and Thomas Fogarty. Works by James Montgomery Flagg, Rose O'Neill, Violet Oakley, Mead Schaefer, Stephen Dohanos, Joe Demers and Bernie Fuchs and Tom Lovell reflect the trends and shifts in magazine illustration during Rockwell's lifetime. Attitudes about commercial art and illustration education at mid-century are reflected in the famous Artist School collection, which contains thousands of illustrations, studies, film-based materials, correspondence, and course books featuring in-depth how-to instruction in the working methods of 12 of the nation's most noted illustrators, from Norman Rockwell to Austin Briggs, Robert Fawcett, and Harold von Schmidt, and of course, Al Dorn, standing closest to us in this photograph with the amazing eyebrows. The collection reveals the ways in which art was viewed as a viable path to a creative and successful life, literally a richer life through art, as seen in the archival footage aired at lunchtime today. Separated from the institutions of high visual culture during the age of abstract expressionism and other mid-century movements, illustrators were interested in the vocabularies of modernism and sought ways to employ them. In the 1950s, a new generation of editorial artists moved beyond prevailing aesthetics in the field, such as Robert Cunningham and Robert Weaver, whose flattened, streamlined compositions and simultaneous narrations appeared fresh and modern and came to be known as the New Illustration. Two notable collections of art by influential visual commentators of the late 20th century, acquired last year, have much to say about the ways in which the past can teach us about the present if we stop to listen. These include an extensive body of work by Julian Allen, a British-American visual journalist and illustrator, best known for his ability to create realistic, convincing portrayals of unwitnessed events. And Pat Oliphant, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Australian-American artist described by the New York Times in 1990 as the most influential editorial cartoonist of his time. The art of visual storytelling in its many forms today is reflected in acquired works by noted contemporary illustrators who have worked in every facet of the field, including Bass Cove, a master printmaker known for her striking woodcut book jacket and magazine illustrations; Anita Kunz, an incisive political commentator who does a great deal of work for The New Yorker. Some of you may recognize it. And Elwood Smith, a brilliant humorist whose drawings appeared for decades in the New York Times, Washington Post, and many other publications, children's books, and products, making somewhat serious statements with humorous artwork. Currently in the museum archives, which contains an approximately 400,000 objects, a 2-year project to preserve, detailed, process, digitize, and make accessible 5 ephemeral photographic and correspondence collections will illuminate the ways in which illustrators and the corporations and advertising agencies they worked for shaped identity and promoted commerce in mid-20th century America. The collections will help researchers examine how cultural stereotypes and expectations, gender and racial portrayals and omissions, and images of achievement and success were presented to engage a targeted audience and elicit a specific public response. Making these and other collections available through digitization and online access is a major step in making illustration a significant field of cultural and historical scholarship. The results of this type of work across institutions is far-reaching, and it has made historically and critically informed scholarship possible, much of it directly traceable to scholar access to digitized artworks and archives. Thank you so much, and I very much look forward to hearing our next presentations. I'd like to invite Kim Conaty and Farris Wahbeh to, I'll stop sharing and invite them to step in.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
I can, yes.
Great, excellent. So Kim is going to be driving the PowerPoint today.
Okay, great.
So thank you everyone for being here remotely, and thank you for all the organizers for having us today. It's really nice to connect with everybody. So we're going to be talking about the illustrations in the Sanborn Hopper Archive at the Whitney Museum of American Art. The presentation is going to be, half of it will be me discussing Edward Hopper at the Whitney and the archives, and then Kim, my colleague, will get into the illustrations. So as Kim is starting to share her screen, you know, the Whitney, as some of you may know, has had a very extensive history with Edward Hopper. We had his first solo show in 1920, and then his last retrospective in 1950. After his passing in 1967, he actually, his passing in 1967, and then Josephine Nevison Hopper in 68, they bequeathed his entire holdings to the Whitney. So we have over 3,000 works of art by Edward Hopper and Josephine Nevison Hopper in our collections, which I'll get into now. As you can see, we have really great examples of his paintings, over 200 paintings, including the seminal Early Sunday Morning, which the Whitney purchased in 1930. And then the next slide, Kim. We also have his early paintings as well from 1914, Soir Blue, as well as his really evocative paintings of New York interiors, as you can see here with New York Interior, aptly titled. Next slide. As well as many, many drawings. We have over 2,800 drawings by Hopper. Some of them are studies for his iconic works such as Gas, which is at MoMA, as well as Office at Night, excuse me. And so it really shows his really evolving practice of really structuring his paintings, as well as his work with studies and sketches. And really gives a sense of his overview of his artistic practice early in his days as a student with Robert Henrine. And then you can see at the next slide, a lot of prints, which some of you may know, he actually really had his breakthrough with printmaking, which was sort of the bridge from him becoming an illustrator to printmaking, and finally what he's known for, his paintings. We also have a lot of materials as well, such as his artist ledger books, which were actually done with his wife, Josephine Nevison Hopper, which really document all his paintings. As you can see in this example to the right, they would meticulously redraw his paintings and really put interesting notes that really talks about the paintings, where they were painted, what time of day sometimes, where they were dropped off at the Wren Gallery. So it really gives a great picture of his artistic output. Next slide. We also have as well in the archives the Edward and Josephine Hopper Research Collection, which includes over 80 linear feet of material documenting the really long and strong relationship that Edward Hopper had with the museum. Like I mentioned, in 1920, he had his first solo show at the Studio Club, the Whitney Museum's predecessor, but he also was a member. And so he really took a lot of classes there while we were a Studio Club sort of atmosphere. And the archives are actually an output of the catalog raisonné that was published by the Whitney. So it really collates together a large body of work about Edward Hopper, including correspondence that he did with our curator and director, Lloyd Goodrich, who was the curator of his 1950 retrospective at the Whitney. On the next slide, you'll see certain examples of that. So you can see, you know, Edward Hopper really admired Lloyd Goodrich. He really they were good friends, and Lloyd really wrote a lot about him. You can see here this manuscript that he wrote for the retrospective that was reproduced in the Edward Hopper Drawings catalog from a few years ago. So really documenting sort of outside of the artistic practice his really collegial relationships with curators such as Lloyd Goodrich. On the next slide, you can see what the contents of the Sanborn Hopper archives are, which will be discussed. Kim will be discussing the illustrations that you see in the first line there. There's over 3,000 archival materials relating to Edward Hopper's life. So memorabilia, ticket stubs, correspondence with notable individuals, galleries, and fans, as well as with his family. And we have a lot of materials, including his notebooks, including his writings on painting. And so it really draws a portrait of Edward Hopper as he sort of compiled it himself, which is it's a very unique view on Edward Hopper that we are very excited to have in our collections, and which we hope to bring public access in the near future. And in the next slide, it really shows you how the Whitney has become really the major repository of Edward Hopper's materials, whether it's the 3,000 plus works from the permanent collection, to the archival material in the research collection, to now the Sanborn Hopper collection, which really combined make a really amazing foundation for really understanding Edward Hopper, not only as an artist, but actually as a man in a historical context, and how he actually thought of himself as an individual. And in the next slide, you can see sort of samplings of these materials. You know, he was an avid theater goer. He loved popular culture. He would go to theater all the time, and you can see some samples here, as well as a really impromptu photo with Josephine Nevison Hopper in a photo booth, which really gives another sort of perspective to his personal life in a visual way, as well as correspondence with his mother when he was traveling, when he was in Paris. And again, more kind of interesting notes on his thoughts about art and history, really. His notes on painting is a fabulous notebook that really details his thoughts about his place in the world and his thoughts about theories of the world. And he wrote a lot of artist statements about the impact of art and what he thought art should be, not only in terms of his current sort of historical context, but also in a larger, broad art historical purview. While many people paint him as a very reticent man, he was actually quite self-conscious about how he positioned himself, and you get a sense of that in the archives from what is extant in the collections. So that gives you kind of a context for his sort of relationship to the Whitney and the physical materials that are housed in our collection, which we would like to, we are planning on opening to the public in the near future. So that kind of gives you that sort of broad brushstroke of the Whitney's holdings of Hopper and our relationship with him. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Kim to speak about illustrations for what everyone is here to speak about today.
Thanks, Farris. To pick up from here, I'll focus on one of the major concentrations in the Sanborn Hopper archive, which is the collection of over 500 items pertaining to Hopper's early career as an illustrator. Here now on the screen, you have an archives action shot to get us started, featuring Farris and two of the curatorial staff members working with us on our Hopper processing and research. For the purposes of today's conference, and specifically this panel's focus on new resources, Farris and I wanted to share some information about the illustration-related material in the archive and highlight the exciting research opportunities it will afford. Although the archive is still being processed, as Farris mentioned, we hope this can serve as a sneak peek and as an enticement for future visits. I should note at the outset, Hopper's foundational career as an illustrator is not in and of itself newsworthy. Like many artists of his generation, Hopper studied illustration in school before shifting over to the fine arts and began his professional career at an advertising agency, C. Coles Phillips and Company in New York in 1905. Several scholars have documented and discussed Hopper's nearly 2-decade-long period working as an illustrator, and how in the mid-1920s, when he began to gain broader recognition for his etchings and paintings, Hopper left the field behind. Somewhat like Charles Dana Gibson, as Michael noted in this morning's introduction, sailing off for the promise of a freer career. And in fact, interestingly, within the archive, there is a group of some 50 illustrations by Gibson that Hopper himself collected. So we know that he was specifically interested in that precedent. Hopper famously referred, however, to his illustrations as, quote, pot boiling work, especially later in his career when trying to shun probing questions from interviewers. He grumbled about the perils of the freelancer knocking door to door and that lack of creative freedom that he felt. But it's important to note that he was enormously successful in what had, by the early 20th century, become a highly competitive field. He was actively taking on new assignments and receiving payment every 1 to 2 weeks for several years, as we know from his notes and ledger books. Prior to the acquisition of the Sanborn Hopper Archive, the Whitney's permanent collection already represented a small number of materials related to Hopper's illustration career, 4 examples of which you see here. The drawing on the left from the Bulletin of the New York Edison Company, for example, was done by Hopper while he was working for Coles Phillips between 1905 and 1907. But these drawings and watercolors in the collection appear to be works that were submitted yet never published. And perhaps this is why Hopper retained the original artwork and that it is still extant today. The materials in the Sanborn Hopper Archive, however, are largely illustrations that were published, and these appear now in the archive in various forms. In some cases as full publications that include his illustrations, and this could be covers of magazines or interior illustrations of magazines, in which case we might have the full magazine itself. In other cases, we have tear sheets, either that he was sent or that he collected from the final publications. And in smaller numbers, we have printers and color proofs. In the next slide, I've put together sort of top-line introduction to these materials organized into categories related to the type of publication or client for which the work was created. The first category I'm showing is trade publications, with a specific example of System magazine, now known as Business Week. I should add one more caveat, as we've mentioned, that we're still processing these materials. I'm sorry for the poor quality of my images here. These are all literally snapshots we've been taking as we've been looking at the materials in the archive. Hopper created several illustrations for System between 1911 and 1916, mostly illustrating stories within the magazine, not covers. The cover you see here was not done by Hopper. They are black and white office scenes with businessman types, offering generalized interactions between figures and spaces that of course now appear as precursors to Hopper the painter's later office scenes. There is much interpretive work to be done with these illustrations still, but I want to make a key point about the material nature of the items in the archive, something that Farris and I have been thinking a lot about and which we want to emphasize. Although many of these published illustrations can be found in other libraries and in a few cases are digitized online, we believe first and foremost there is great value in having the breadth of Hopper's illustration work together in one place, to be able to look across the various assignments and see a clear style and even a set of preferred subjects emerge. As significantly, the archive tells us something about the care Hopper took in his illustration work, how he kept all of these materials, how he included, or in some cases was asked to include, his name on the illustrations themselves, something that artists didn't always do, or if they were truly averse to this pot-boiling work, might have opted to use a nom de plume. So you'll notice, I think you can see my cursor here, that Edward Hopper's name, for example, in the center image for the article, The Man for the Job, his name is nearly as prominent as that of the author of the article itself. Another group of trade magazines in the archive includes Tavern Topics and Hotel Management, both New York-based publications for which Hopper produced covers and some interior illustrations in the 1920s. Both were engines of the hospitality industry, Hotel Management for the business side and Tavern Topics for hotel guests. We have both clipped covers and full issues of several of these publications, which have been the subject of important recent scholarship through the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts' exhibition Hopper and the American Hotel, which some of you may have seen. The other major category of publications represented in the Sanborn Hopper Archive is the house organ, or those in-house publications produced as informational and promotional materials for employees and in some cases for a wider public. Oops, sorry here. I've included here a few particularly compelling examples from the Morse Dry Dock Dial, published from the Brooklyn-based business for its Employees Association. Again, the opportunity to see these covers alongside those for hotel management, system, and others, and with the benefit of being able to fast forward through the whole of Hopper's career as a painter, one really begins to see the choices that Hopper made in his illustration work. By working for trades and house organs, he knew the types of subjects he'd be asked to depict, and many are ones that had interested him since he was a young boy. It's hard not to see these covers, for example, without thinking of the hundreds of sketches and doodles of ships on the Hudson that Hopper made from his childhood home in Nyack. Another example is the Wells Fargo Messenger, which offers a distinct approach in that, in this case, Hopper illustrated both front and back covers. You see him here taking advantage of this format to produce a two-part sequence about war savings stamps. And Wells Fargo Messenger is also interesting in relation to the particular material we have in the archive. It's the only case where we have a set of color proofs that indicate some of the working process between artist and client, which is, I think, would be a fascinating area of further scholarship for Hopper. And we do have some of these materials in the archive here, but a lot of additional material still needs to be tracked down elsewhere. Finally, the archive includes a number of advertisements, some of which have been documented in previous literature, but most of which require much more investigation and interpretation. Unlike Hopper's magazine work, we have no examples of advertisements that show Hopper's work in situ, that is, in one of the contexts in which it might have appeared. And some seem to have also been made for signage, so that could explain some of the reasons why we don't have magazines with this specific image included. But we see clearly through these works, done through major advertising agencies like Sherman and Bryan, BBDO, and Gray, among others, that fashion, particularly the modern businessman, was a key subject for Hopper. And that Hopper often worked in a manner quite typical of the burgeoning advertising world, in which different individuals with specialized skills contributed elements to a single ad. In these cases, Hopper would have done the figures and dress, and others would have contributed text and other details. And there are many other fascinating one-offs on other topics in this material. The ad on the left for National Cigar Stands seems to reveal more than any other advertisement that I personally have seen so far, Hopper's relationship to Coles Phillips' innovative play with the fadeaway technique. Oh, sorry, that was my alarm. So I'm finishing, Stephanie, I promise. The fadeaway technique, that's background and foreground, or the ad on the right for a New York City-based construction firm that employs a horizontal brick wall, both subject and compositional strategy for a burr and header. So I'll leave off here with an indication of just a couple of the many directions the new archival material may, from connections between Hopper's illustrations and his paintings to more intensive studies of the illustrations and advertisements themselves. We look forward to opening this up to you all. And if the talks earlier today are any indication, there's a lot of fascinating stuff to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for a fascinating presentation, and look forward to discussing it a little bit later. We were fortunate at the Rockwell Museum to have a loan of, I think, about 40 Hopper illustrations for an exhibition several years ago about his illustration career, and they're amazing. They really are wonderful. Our next up is our Jonathan and Clara.
Let me say again how grateful I am, or thank you guys for doing this. I think it's wonderful, and I have to give a special thanks to Michael Bell, who was a long time ago my student and has gone on to do such extraordinary things, and thank him for inviting me to be a part of this. I also want to, of course, thank the president of the Maurice Sendak Foundation and Clara, who's also going to be talking about our wonderful relationship that the foundation has with the University of Connecticut. So the Maurice Sendak Foundation is much newer than the Norman Rockwell Museum, and obviously than Whitney. Maurice, and I say Maurice because I grew up with him, and so it's strange for me to refer to him by his last name. Maurice died in 2012. The foundation actually existed during his lifetime, but the archive and the house I'm going to show you, the house obviously was there for a long time, but the archive building is relatively new, and we're still very much a work in progress. So let me just get into this. This is just a screenshot of the website. So I welcome everyone to go to the website, the sendakfoundation.org, and you can get more information about the foundation. For example, things like the mission statement, which tells you what we're all about. Noting the idea that we don't we don't accept unsolicited grant proposals, but we can get a sense of the kind of range of things that we do. One of the obvious primary functions of the foundation is to promote the legacy of Maurice's work and his amazing books. He illustrated something like 170 books and many books of his own work. One of the things that the foundation it's very exciting is we're working to have almost every book that he did be in print. And in fact, during his lifetime, that was not the case. And so that's a very exciting thing. We also, as you probably know, it's that Maurice Sendak worked on so many different fields, not just children's books and illustrated grown-ups books, but also had an extraordinary career in the theater. And one of the exciting projects is we helped sponsor the remaking of The Magic Flute, the Portland Opera. This just gives you a sense of some of the things that we do. Philanthropy in terms of supporting the Good Dog Foundation, the Maurice Sendak Community School, issues of literacy, animal welfare. These are some of the things that we promote and are part of our philanthropies. And then another really exciting aspect of the foundation is the Sendak Fellowship, which began during Maurice's lifetime, in which he invited a few illustrators every year to come to a house on his property, and for a month they got to work, but also to be mentored by Maurice. And there's more information again about this on the website. It's in hiatus right now as we begin to craft a new vision for the fellowship to move it more towards a workshop, but even after Maurice died, we continued it for several years. And you can see my president, Lynn Caponara, with Doug Salati and Richard Eggleston and Gregory McGuire having a sort of discussion, a session. Doug at that time, he now works for the foundation, but he is a Sendak Fellow, and he was mentored in this wonderful kind of mentoring process. And so the other part, I guess, which is what is of great interest to everyone here, is the aspect of the collections that we have. And Clara's going to talk about the book art, all the works, all the illustrations, all the drawings and sketches that Maurice did for particular books, including, of course, Where the Wild Things Are, is now housed at the University of Connecticut, and Clara will talk more about that. But a lot of his work and his own art collection is in his house in Richfield, and this wonderful little building designed by Dewey Dickinson, which is the archive building. And here you can see Maurice in his studio in 1985. The house is in Richfield. He moved to Richfield in 1971. He didn't really start living there until 1972. And then for the rest of his life, that's where he did most of his work. So again, since everybody knows Where the Wild Things Are, that was done in New York on 9th Street. I remember the apartment on 9th Street very well. But other later works, well, like outside over there, were all done in this particular studio. And we feel very strongly, I think partially because both Lynn and me, we've known Maurice since we were teenagers. We kind of grew up in this house. We felt it was really, really important that this place be preserved. And you're seeing the studio here on the left, and on the right, you're seeing the archive building. It's a fantastic space that Duo designed. It was really Lynn's idea to build it. She had the idea that it would be like a shaker meeting hall. You can't really see it, but it has a great kind of wonderful dome, and you can lay out work. You can even lay out a little exhibition in this space. The kinds of things that we have at the in Richfield, and I should say, people ask, it's not. I think on Google or something, it still refers to it as a museum. It's not a museum. It's not zoned as a museum, and right now we're not open to the public. Eventually, we will have tours, by appointment. But it really is more like a research center, a place that we want to encourage scholars to come and do research on Maurice. And as a result, we have in the collection things like photographs, family photographs. I'm just showing you a picture here of Maurice's mother, his brother and sister. And you can see, this would be example on the right of a work that's at UCONN, Randall Gerald's Fly-by-Night. You can see his mother here taken right from the photograph. Maurice loved to work from photographs. He often even traced. He used a light box. We have his original light box in the studio, so you get to see things like that. We have all of his self-portraits, and we have a lot of his earliest work, is what I guess you would call juvenilia. So this is one of the, I suppose, earliest works in the collection, where you can see a little drawing. Michael should like this because it relates to Liechtenstein, of Mickey Mouse. Maurice was obsessed with Mickey Mouse. They both share the same birth year, 1928. And this is a self-portrait that he did for TV Guide in 1978 for Mickey's birthday, and obviously for Maurice's birthday. So this would be in the collection. We also have, Maurice was a painter. So it's kind of reversal of some of the things we've been talking about today, where he painted. He never was, to be honest, he didn't treat his paintings very well. He was kind of ambivalent about them, and we've had to conserve some of them because he didn't treat them so well. But this is a portrait, for example, on the right of his partner of 50 years, who was my mother's best friend, the the psychiatrist Eugene Glynn. And on the left, this is his brother Jack. Jack collaborated with him, as we're going to see, on toys, and Jack also was a writer of children's books. So we have these early paintings. This is a book that I worked on after Eugene died, and a collection of his writings on art history. So it's also, for me, very important to note that this house, and we have the materials about Eugene's life. He was really an amazing writer on art history, and particularly on the relationship of creativity and theories of creativity. We have a really important aspect of Maurice's work, which is his fantasy sketches. These are drawings that he would do often to music, and the idea is that he would listen to a piece of music and he'd come up with an idea, but he'd have to finish the idea over the course of the piece of music. And we're actually working on a book of those drawings that should come out in the next few years. These are the toys that Maurice did with his brother Jack, and with some help from his sister. And with these toys, actually, that I can't demonstrate to them for you, but they have this wonderful contraption that Jack works so that they would pop up. This is Little Red Riding Hood. And Maurice brought this to FAO Schwartz, and they told him that it was too expensive to make, but they hired him to do window decorations. And it's really through that he got into the world of children's books. This is in the 50s. We have a lot of the materials that relate to his theater work. 5 of the major productions are owned by the Morgan. Some of you may have seen the show that the Morgan recently did on his theater productions. But we have the other, I don't know, there's something like 10 other productions that is at the house in the archive. For example, Higgly Piggly Pop. This is a storyboard. Some of you may know Higgly as a wonderful book that Maurice did, but he also did an opera with Ollie Nussin that was a double bill with Where the Wild Things Are. And he also did a marvelous, both an animated cartoon, really Rosie, for television with Carole King, and that became a Broadway musical. And we have both all the stuff that goes with the animated production, but we also have all the stuff that goes with the theater production. And you can see how fantastic these works are. This is something that Michael was very interested in, and we showed him, which is that Maurice from time to time worked in advertising quite early. It's interesting parallel with Andy Warhol. But one of the productions that he did, which is fantastic, is later in the 90s, he worked on something for Bell Atlantic, which no longer exists, but is, I guess it's the parent, it was the original Verizon, right? And he did a kind of later version of Wild Things. So Maurice refused to do a second Wild Things Part 2, but this is in a way as close as he got to, because there's even an animated cartoon that was done for it, and there's a kind of story, and it's fantastic posters that he did for that. Oh, excuse me. And then the other part that we have, which is really quite wonderful, and that's a privilege to have, is we have all the art that he collected. And he was a wonderful collector who collected English Romantic art and German Romantic art. He collected Winslow Homer. Here you're seeing William Blake's Song of Innocence. And so anybody who's interested in the sourcing of his work would look to the collection. As you know, he was obsessed with Winsor McCay, and you can see the relationship of a work that we have in the house from Little Nemo at Slumberland. We have the original drawings. We also have the way the cartoon, the strip appeared in the newspaper, and you can compare that with In the Night Kitchen, or Winslow Homer and Outside Over There, or we have this little Grimm print. A lot of people don't know that Ludwig Grimm, one of the Grimm brothers, is also an artist, and you can see how Maurice cribbed, he would say stole from Grimm for his illustration for the juniper tree. So I'm just going to end here with a bit of nostalgia, because boy, do I miss Barack Obama and Michelle, although they're still around, but I wish he was still president. And here, Michelle and Barack are doing Where the Wild Things Are. It turns out that Barack Obama's favorite book, he actually said it's his all-time favorite book, not just his favorite children's book, is Where the Wild Things Are. And every year they would perform it during Easter. And of course, we have a lot of photographs and materials around the history of Maurice's work and the reception of his work too at the archive. So I'd be happy to answer questions. And right now I'm going to pass this on to Clara, and she'll talk about UCONN.
And can you hear me, just in case?
I hear you.
Perfect, thank you. All right, well, first I want to start off by saying thank you so much for the organizers of this conference, for inviting me to speak, Jonathan Weinberg, Michael LaBelle. It's so nice to see new and also familiar faces during this time of isolation. So this is very, it's a nice respite during these difficult times that we are experiencing. So I'm just going to dive right in. I am the project archivist for the Maurice Sendak collection at the University of Connecticut. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about who we are at Archives and Special Collections, about what is the Maurice Sendak collection, what it includes, and also details on how to access the collection itself. So Archives and Special Collections, this is our mission statement here, and I don't want to go into too much depth because it's a wordy statement, but it's meaningful. But I've bolded 3 particular phrases that we believe is very important to our identity, which is that archives reveals, archives inspires, and that archives should be open or accessible to the public. And so those are the 3 tenets that we effectively work on to service the mission of UCONN at the University of Connecticut through their research, through teaching, service, and outreach missions. So what is the Maurice Sendak collection at UCONN? We are thrilled to have it here. It is a wonderful, prestigious collection. And I just want to note very quickly, I believe that these PowerPoints will be shared after the fact, and these links here are hyperlinked. So if you were to select them, it will link out directly into the image that's shown on the left, on your left screen. So this would link out to the collection page for the Maurice Sendak collection, and that page includes an overview of the collection, what our access and reproduction policies are, in addition to any current news and events, and also contact details, because they're always important. Oops, excuse me, went right towards that. So I want to also share this. I don't know why this is flipping. Okay, there we go. I've also included this really wonderful quote by Coraline Deibler, who's a professor of illustration at the University of Connecticut. And she essentially says, you're walking across campus and taking a master class with Maurice Sendak just by sitting in the archives in our reading room. And what really struck me with that statement is that you have this level of intimacy that really is wonderful. It's a unique experience in any right. So about the collection as a whole, the collection includes all published works, not all published works, excuse me, all just the published works by Maurice Sendak. So that's about 76 titles. And this includes about over 7,500 individual items in the collection. It includes preliminary drawings, final drawings, acetate overlays, storyboards, proofs, dummies. So what we really have on deposit at UCONN is the entire creative breadth of a title, which is of a book, of a published book, which is very exciting to see curation from start to finish. Finish in quotation marks there. So just a little bit more detail, and I'll get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the collection itself, is that the arrangement of the collection, if you're familiar with archives, is that it's important usually to the researcher and also to us and to how we organize our materials. The arrangement is still maintained as it was given to us by the Maurice Sendak Foundation. So that organization has been maintained if it might be useful. And last but not least, but the collection is supported by a generous grant from the Maurice Sendak Foundation. And we're very excited to have it. So if you were to visit UCONN Archives and Special Collections and you wanted to know how to access this collection, I would probably point you first towards our finding aid, again, hyperlinked here. And the collection right now is completely, it's completed online. You are able to access it through the finding aid to identify what it is that you are looking for. It is completed to the box level and is organized chronologically by publication title. So 1952, The Wonderful Farm, to 2003, Presto and Zesto and Limbo Land being the most recent. The itemized finding aid is still in progress. I would say that we're about a third of the way through as of this time in completion. What that means is that if, say you're looking at where the wild things are, and you are looking box by box. So box 1, for example, would be final drawings and would be itemized 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What is exactly in there? Again, the collection, I just want to emphasize that the collection is open and available for research, but some materials may be limited from time to time at the discretion of the Maurice Sendak Foundation and also Archives and Special Collections. So I do recommend connecting with me or my team at your earliest convenience if you are looking to use the archives, because we would like to make sure that it is accessible at that time. But if you are not able to visit, which is currently the case right now for everyone, we are not able to visit most of these beloved archives and museums. If you're not, we do have an online repository as of this time. This is very much a work in progress, but we are hosted through the Connecticut Digital Repository, better known by the acronym of CTDA. So this is just a good sort of feeler for what it is that we do have in the archives, and just gives you a bit of an entry point. Again, hyperlinked through this link right there. And a quick note to say that all images are copyright the Maurice Sendak Foundation and all rights are reserved. So please reach out to the Sendak Foundation in the event that you would like to reproduce something. And a little more note, I'm just going to switch gears just a bit here about our programming and outreach as well. This is a highly active collection. It's being used by UCONN faculty and students. We've had international researchers come to UCONN to explore the collection. So we're really getting a strong taste of how much and how meaningful Maurice Sendak was to all of these individuals, and not even researchers, but just people who were in love with his works as well. And so just a little note, because I know Michael Lobel is here, and so is Laura Sagisag. We did have and Jonathan Weinberg, of course. We also, we had a symposium last semester entitled In the Night Kitchen 50 Years Later. It is the 50th year anniversary of this book, so we are very much looking forward to it. But this book, this symposium and exhibition was made to celebrate this new publication, upcoming publication of this book. And because we are at UCONN and we are a university, education is our primary focus. This collection has been incorporated into our teaching curriculum at UCONN and includes classes in English, illustration, costume design, first year engagement, which is a sort of broad class for freshmen to take and familiarize themselves with what is available on campus, and early college experience for our high school students as well. So just a note to our listeners that the collection is available, not right now for tours and just discussions if you reach out and arrange a visit. And I just want to end on, we did have an exhibition opening on March 16th. Unfortunately, that was when the university effectively shut down our premises, so we can't have this exhibition open to the public, but we are working on making a digital online experience of this exhibition. And a quick note to say that while the reading room is closed, while our physical premises are closed, we are still at Archives and Special Collections responding to inquiries, and we're still available for your research needs. And I'm just going to end with my contact details there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Clara. What a fascinating and wonderful collaboration between the two organizations, and look forward to hearing more about that.
Can I just add just a thought? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So it just occurred to me that one thing which I think is different about our situation from, for example, the Norman Rockwell situation, maybe not entirely different, but is that, but I remember this was a big issue when we were talking about housing the work in a library archive, which is that we're still using the material. In other words, we're still publishing. We have an extraordinary project with Stephen Steinhauer's scanning, rescanning a lot of the books, right? So the work has a kind of living life to it within publishing, and that's one of the things I think Clara is referring to. So it could, if you contact us and you need a particular, let's say right now you needed to look at fantasy sketches, they might not be available because they're being scanned. So it has that aspect, which is very exciting on the one hand, but it's also a little different from a lot of other archives where the work, I hate to use it, but librarians, I think, sometimes talk about the material being dead, meaning that, it's not needed anymore by the artist or the writer, right? So that's a little different. And again, also, I want to, of course, if you have questions, please contact me, look at the website. We have contact information there. So please do that. Thank you, Clara, by the way. Great.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yes.
And thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you both. It was fantastic. Loved hearing about your collaboration. And next up is Laura Fravel from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. I know that I was a late addition to this panel, but I am delighted to have this chance to share some of our ongoing cataloging projects at Cooper Hewitt. A little bit about my position. I'm there on a 3-year grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, in a position that's really focused on access and advocacy for the American collection. That includes research and cataloging, trying to get more of this up on our website and make it searchable, but also getting to share some of that work at events like this. The American Art Collection at Cooper Hewitt has more than 10,000 objects. I think about 1,500 of those are related to illustration, and that number may change as this cataloging project continues. But today I thought it'd be helpful to offer kind of an introduction to the collection. So first a little institutional history, and then offer kind of a brief tour of some of the highlights. So our story today starts with sisters Sarah and Eleanor Hewitt. In 1897, they established a teaching collection, the Cooper Union Museum for the Arts of Decoration, to inspire good design in American industry. It was the first American museum founded by women and the first American museum dedicated to design. Though the museum has undergone a move and several name changes, it has continued to educate, inspire, and empower people through design. The sisters were uniquely positioned for their undertaking. Their father and uncle were both mayors of New York. Their mother was a staunch advocate of arts education and volunteered at Candace Wheeler's Society of Decorative Art to champion employment opportunities for women. Their grandfather, Peter Cooper, was a successful inventor, manufacturer, philanthropist, and politician. He is probably best remembered as the inventor of the Tom Thumb, the first American-built steam locomotive, and for his role in laying the first transatlantic cable. You may not know that he made a fortune in glue manufacturing as well, and patented gelatin, the forerunner to Jell-O. With little formal education, Peter Cooper dedicated himself to the belief that education was a right of mankind. He founded the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in 1859, a free school in New York City offering practical education for adults. He intended the museum to have a teaching collection, but it was not until the 1890s that this dream was realized by his enterprising granddaughters. And if you're curious to read more about Sarah and Eleanor's efforts, we have this publication on the right available as a PDF on our website. We also have a section of our blog devoted to the Hewitt family and to the sisters collecting trips in Europe. It's full of all sorts of wonderful tidbits. Like at their dress fittings, the sisters would climb a ladder to test whether anyone would be able to see under their skirts while they were working in the library. Today, I wanted to turn to something that Eleanor wrote towards the end of her life, reflecting on the plans for the museum and its collection, the making of a modern museum. In it, she discusses the museum's growing American art collection. It seems like an odd choice for a design museum to collect drawings, but the Hewitt sisters saw value in studying an artist's working methods. Quote, "The first conception of numerous well-known pictures, perhaps jotted down merely on an envelope, box cover, or chance scrap of paper, are there to inspire and illuminate students and laymen. The value is beyond words, and not one atom of the work of an artist should ever be destroyed, since the study of the change of style, manner, technique, and character of a work in composition from youth to age often adds valuable instruction." And going off of that, I think that the American Art Collection at Cooper Hewitt is really focused on process. It includes notes, sketches, studies, but not the finished work. I think that our collections of Winslow Homer, Frederick Church, and Thomas Brand are perhaps the best well known, but wanted to include the slide to give a sense of the range. And really the persuasive powers of the Hewitt sisters helped to grow this collection. According to museum lore, they played bridge with Winslow Homer's elder brother, Charles Savage Homer Jr., and his wife, Maddie. Charles was the sole heir to the archive of unsold works that remained in Homer's Pratt's studio. And in 1912, Charles donated several hundred drawings to the fledgling museum. This encouraged other donations of American art, including around 2,000 sketches and oil studies by Frederick Edwin Church, given by his son Lewis P. Church in 1917 from what remained at Olana. And the Homer collection seems particularly relevant to our panel today. It spans the artist's career, including images from the Civil War and his time in Cullercoats, England, and also includes studies for some of his best-known paintings, like the Lifeline and the Gulf Stream. Within the Civil War drawings are studies for some of his earliest illustrations, and I was excited to see that Michael shared the same image this morning. For example, the figure of Dixie here, sitting on a barrel of contraband, appears in the lower right of the published spread in Harper's Weekly at left. The Cooper Union's museum became part of the Smithsonian in the 1960s and moved to the Upper East Side. The collection is now located in the former Carnegie Mansion in Museum Mile near the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Guggenheim. And I think that somewhere in that move, the American Illustration Collection became folded in the American Art Collection, so it was not thought of as a separate focus. It used to be a distinct collecting area, and curators used to solicit gifts from publishers, illustrators, and their families specifically for the American Illustration Collection. The museum actually began collecting illustration more than a decade before it began interested in studies for well-known paintings. The illustration on the left by Frances Hopkinson Smith was one of the first works by an American artist to enter the collection. The work on the right entered the collection more than 20 years later, though still within the Hewitt sisters' lifetime, and happens to be for the same publication. And I particularly like that you can see Hop Smith at work here, that he's got his paper set up, he's sketching the fruit market in Venice. And both of these are for Venice of today. And here I'll just give a shout out to the museum's library, which is a wonderful resource for researching illustration, in part because it grew up alongside the illustration collection to really support it. And thinking of how the collection grew too, I think a lot of the shape of the collection grew to respond to the needs of professional designers, students at the Cooper Union, and students at the Cooper Union Women's Art School. That illustration was seen as a profession that could offer a fairly stable income for a lot of practicing designers, and had few barriers for women artists to enter. And New York was the center of the publishing world in the US, so there were ample opportunities for women to enter that field. Many artists and designers who were illustrators also pursued careers as stained glass designers, mural painters, fine artists, portrait painters, in addition to illustration. But illustration became the bread and butter for many working artists because it could offer a relatively stable income. And I think that one of the wonderful things about our collection, because it grew up alongside the Women's Art School as well, is that it has this focus on women artists. So here I have Mary Halleck Foote on the left and Winslow Homer on the right. Our collections of Winslow Homer are fairly well known. Mary Halleck Foote, not so much. She was an illustrator working in the American West about a generation later, but a very similar sensibility. And just to show some more of their published works side by side. And then someone near and dear to my heart, Elizabeth Shippen Green Elliott. Right now I'm working on an article on her time in New York. But she was the first woman to join the elite staff of the art department at Harper's Magazine. And she began her professional life in Philadelphia as one of the Red Rose Girls alongside Jessie Wilcox Smith and Violet Oakley, but then spent the second half of her life in New York, where her husband was the head of the education department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When they were in New York, they lived on the Upper East Side, about 2 blocks from Cooper Hewitt's present location, which is a nice connection. And I think that this figure on the right, the young man, is actually modeled on her husband. It has the same profile, and this was done shortly after their marriage. But to me, one of the amazing things about this collection of original illustration is you get to see the experimental approach to media that many illustrators employed. Like here, it's a charcoal drawing, then varnished with gouache over the top, which is anticipating what the final printed image would look like, trying to make contrasts a little sharper, accent some of the contours. And that's a thread that you see running throughout the collection. Alice Cordelia Morse worked as a stained glass designer for Tiffany, but also had a successful career as a book cover designer, book covers and spines. And one of my favorite works in our collection is this title page for Occupations of Women and Their Compensation. It seems especially timely since we're in the centennial of women's suffrage this year, but was intended for this book about professions for women where they could earn a stable living. It was a collection of essays that were published in the New York Tribune in their women's page. And unfortunately, the final publication was not illustrated, so the title page was not used. But I do think it stands up on its own. Florence Choate, children's book illustrator from New Jersey. We have about 500 works from her estate, which are largely cataloged thanks to the efforts of our Hunter Mellon Fellow last summer. And I particularly like this little alligator in the coal scuttle. And I think another thread running through the collection is this wonderful emphasis on humor. Also in the work of Christina Mallman, prolific illustrator working in New York in the 1930s and 40s. She designed 34 covers for the New Yorker and 500 spot illustrations to go inside the magazine. On the left here, you can see the birds watching the bird watchers. On the right, this huge crowd pushing other people out of the way, trying to get attention in front of the New York Public Library. And throughout her work, there's this very endearing sense of humor, kind of poking fun at life in the city. Building on that idea of humor, we have 2 volumes related to Frederick Stewart Church, the other Fred Church in our collection. Illustrator working in New York in the late 19th and early 20th century, known for his animal humor. So here you see the giraffe wrapping its neck around that tree trunk for the back cover of the World's Almanac. Here you can see a intrepid marine painter strapping herself to a sea serpent so she can get a better view. And through this 2-volume scrapbook, you see archival material, published illustrations, sketches for illustrations. This was not put together by the artist, but by Dr. Dudley Tenney, a friend of his, a correspondent who also was interested in illustration. Dudley Tenney's library was auctioned off after his death. It included huge holdings related to illustration, especially early illustrations for Sherlock Holmes. But within the scrapbooks, we have correspondence between the 2, which I think gives some insight into Frederick Stewart Church's working process. So you get a sense of where he's working in the city and how. Here's a letter he wrote talking about visiting the Central Park Zoo. He's joking that he got down into the water to go eye to eye with the hippo, get a better view. Less active, but here he's in his studio with his stuffed flamingo, trying to get it ready for an illustration. And even in here, there's this emphasis in our collection on process, on the earliest sketches, kind of working up to that final image, whether it's how I discovered the North Pole or the story on wolves. And I think that translates to some of the sort of more conservative works in our collection as well. These were 2 larger illustrations for the cover of the book buyer in a short series focused on the publishing industry. So here we have the illustrator and the printer at work. And here gives you a sense of what these would have looked like in their published format. But large areas of the collection are focused on the process leading up to that final published illustration. These are both by Kenyon Cox, better known as a mural painter, but throughout his life, supported himself also as an illustrator. In a lot of his work, you can see his notes from the publisher, these grids for transfer, some notes about revisions, and get a sense of the process that goes into that final image. We have about 100 works donated from Scrivener's Magazine, focusing on headers, footers, little images at the end, so all the other things that make a publication feel complete but often get overlooked, which are these incredibly detailed pen and ink drawings up close. And then also thinking of Scrivener's, we have an interesting group that came in through separate gifts kind of later in the museum's life from 3 different illustrators collaborating on this project of Teddy Roosevelt writing about the life of Oliver Cromwell. This is right before Roosevelt becomes president. He's thinking about what leadership qualities and what that might entail. But it's 3 illustrators, one of whom is working abroad, all collaborating on this series of 6 stories that come out in Scrivener's Magazine. And it's interesting to see kind of where they diverge, where the illustrators were not talking to each other, but also what notes the publishers gave them to try to make this seem coherent. This is a work that I often pull out to illustrate the importance of research and thinking about the original context for these works. Sweet little Gothic building, man feeding pigeons. But the original caption for this had to do with execution, that this is where his head was shown on a pole. So it gives a very different context to what seems like a very mundane image. And then I know my time is running short, but I just want to give a little sampling of kind of other highlights in our collection just to entice you to explore more, come to the website, think about research. Frank Vincent Dumont, William Leroy Jacobs with the Eiffel Tower in the distance there. Edwin Helen Blashfield with those wonderful lines on the shield. Irving Wiles and Joseph Pinnell. John Sloan, and then this Everett Shin, which I find particularly interesting because it was a gift from the Artist Chair Museum. We had another work by him that he did not think represented him well. So he asked to swap it out in our collection, and he picked this for our illustration collection, which is much more fabulous than the one we originally had. We also have kind of illustration adjacent collections, so not directly related to published images, but showing the thinking that goes into them. Samuel Coleman, first president of the American Watercolor Society, later in life became very interested in how geometric forms underlay a lot of natural forms. But even in his earliest sketches at the Cooper Hewitt, you can see this emphasis on geometry and symmetries. And I think that continues throughout his career. We also have some collections related to artists' autobiographies. A few of these were originally intended as sketches for etchings by Jerome Myers, who was artist on Lower East Side in New York in the early 20th century. I think of him as almost like a roving reporter, that he would wander around with his sketchbook trying to take down life as he saw it there. Upper left, we have an illustration of kind of ethnic types in his neighborhood. Below that, this school group playing outside. On the right, Madison Square Garden, focusing on the crowd there. And then also illustrations for Thomas Hart Benton's autobiography, An Artist in America, where he's traveling on this road trip in the South and Midwest during the Great Depression and describing what he sees, taking it down in images as well. And I will say these are extraordinary in person, that a lot of Benton's work I think of as pen and ink with this brown wash, but especially the one on the left, you can see these bright flashes of lavender that don't show up in reproductions and that you don't see in his autobiography. And then at the end here, I just wanted to encourage you to come visit our study room. It is closed at the moment. Hopefully it will reopen sometime before the fall semester. But can accommodate classes for those of you in the New York area, can accommodate researchers. A lot of our collection is now available through the Smithsonian's Open Access Initiative as well, where you can download high-res images online. We have more information on our blog. And right now, if you go to our website, there is a landing page with resources for remote learning too, that might be helpful. So I will end there. I have my contact information there. I'm happy to answer questions about any of the artists I mentioned, about the collection, about how to research at the Cooper Hewitt. But I know we're about to have a question and answer session in Zoom as well. So.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was absolutely fascinating. And it's just remarkable, given the collections of all of our panelists, how many resources there really are. So we thank you for making people aware of those. I might just start with one question, and then maybe we can open it up to others who would have special interest. But I was wondering, in all the things that you have been diving into so deeply, did any of you encounter an object that really helped you to understand a subject or an artist more deeply, or perhaps presented some surprising information that you found meaningful? It's a tough one. I don't know if anybody would like to give it a try.
I was just sharing some images from that Frederick Stewart Church album, which was a revelation to me. My background is more in American art, and I know a lot of his decorative work, sort of women in landscapes, lounging with tigers, things like that, The Witch's Daughter. But to see all of his illustration together showed a whole new side of his personality.
Oh, hi. So again, because we're so new and so many people who are part of the foundation, Arthur Yorings, who collaborated with Maurice, and Lynn Caponara, who took care of him and was his sort of like daughter, and that is sort of like my sister. So, you know, every day there's something happens that, you know, amazingly, because I would watch Maurice working on things, and but, you know, in the way that you're a kid or whatever, you don't, you know, you're amazed by it, but you're not paying attention necessarily. And Lynn will point to something that's on his desk and say, oh, you know, that little pen holder is actually in the magic flute, you know, and then say, oh yeah. And the weirdest thing for me experience recently is Arthur and Maurice collaborated on a pop-up book called Mom and Mommy, excuse me, it's called Mommy. And when Maurice gave me and my now husband, Nick Boschnack, a copy of it, he signed it. And what we would always do, which is kind of awful, is like we didn't want to ruin them, because as an art historian, you want it to be perfect, and pop-up books are so fragile, right? So I never really looked at it as closely as I should have. And about 6 months ago, it was opened up, and I opened up a panel, and suddenly there was Nick. My husband was one of the characters in it. We had no idea. We knew Nick remembered sort of posing at some point, but he didn't realize that he was actually, in this book. And also it's kind of horrible because I realized that probably Maurice was probably waiting for us to say something to him about that at some point, and we never, said anything about it. So, I mean, that's a very special thing, but every day, I look at a Stubbs etching or some work by William Blake, and I suddenly go, oh my God, that's Maurice's work. So it's a fantastic privilege to be there. Anyway.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. Anyone else have a thought?
I don't know if I'm on. Am I on? Okay. I have just one, which is where I think when I came in, I think we all came in, or most of us did, with Maurice Sendak, and I grew up with his books, and so I had a very distinctive, it's hard to get around an idea of a man until you are face to face with his materials and you're really going through them one by one. But I remember there was this one object that really sort of changed my perception and made me realize how human he really was. And Jonathan, you may remember it, but it's a sketch in Outside Over There. And in Outside Over There, there's a little girl, and she wears a raincoat. It looks like it's a giant yellow raincoat. And so there's multiple images of this little girl in a raincoat, but also a baby who's wearing a little cape as well. But this particular day, he wrote, he drew a little picture of the cape, and underneath it, he wrote, "My shroud. This is the anniversary of my heart attack." And it just strikes you very deeply when you realize how human and how there's so much of a connection there. So that's something that struck out to me.
I've had that experience as well with Rockwell, so I can understand. It really creates a very human connection with the artist.
Yes, because often he's, so often he'll be on the, so he like Norman Rockwell, and he very much admired, Maurice very much admired Norman Rockwell. They're constant situations in which he's on the phone or something, and in all the different layers of work that goes to make any particular picture, and somebody will be on the phone, and then he'll just, he'll write down a telephone number, or he will often write down the music that he's listening to at a time, or some book that somebody mentions, and that'll just be on the side of some drawing. And I always find that just something makes you feel in the moment, just what Laura was talking about in the process of why it is so important to save everything on some level. Although I know in a certain way, I think Maurice would himself, who was a kind of hoarder, he loved to save everything. I think in a certain way, he'd be horrified by the fact that we've saved everything, that there'd probably be a lot of things that he would have thrown out. But
Oh, true. That's great. Kim and Farris, I don't know if you would want to address that at all. And I know Michael has a question for both of you as well. So.
I'm happy to address it quickly. Farris may have some other ideas as well, but with regard to your specific question, Stephanie, I think that what was most compelling to me and becoming more familiar with the illustration material in the archive, and always kind of keeping the back of one's mind Hopper's oft-cited notes about how much he disregarded and disliked his illustration work, was, as I sort of intimated in my presentation, that he cared very deeply about this work. And there was one particular magazine, I wish I could remember which one it was in particular, but it was one of the cases where he had illustrations, not on a cover, but for an article inside. And within a particular spread, there were several illustrations. And I think what had happened was that when the illustrator was noted in the publication, it was not clear who, like which one which one was supposed to be the Hopper illustration, and he had like annotated on that page very clearly in writing, like, not this one. I was like, felt like a real, he was proud of what he did and wanted it to be clear that that was his work and that he would not be mistaken for the other kind of average illustrations out there.
Yeah, and I think to couple with Kim's thought, the one thing that really shocked me in the archive, I guess it's not that shocking, but in 1956, there was an illustration of Edward Hopper on the front cover of Time magazine. And he collected a lot of those copies. And that was so emblematic to me, taken as a whole, because you really get a sense of his self-consciousness of himself. He he disregarded his illustration, like Kim said, but he held it in such reverence in the archives because he maintained and he kept it, and he was, annotating which one was his. He said he disliked the Time magazine cover, but he kept it. So there's this sort of nice tension there in the archive that builds an accumulation when you see an artist's work in total manifested there, because you start seeing the different layers of meaning in the sheer accumulation of this material that really gives another side of a person, really. So that was the one thing in the archive where I was like, oh, he really was really aware of himself. And even though he disliked the article and the cover, you should check it out. It's the 1956 Time cover. It's really kind of a garish illustration of it. He actually kept them. And so you really get this sense of Edward Hopper in a more intimate and historical level.
Fascinating. Thank you all. Michael Lobel, I think you have a question. Would you like to turn on your microphone and ask your question?
Yeah, well, first, again, I want to thank everyone. That was fantastic and really lovely insight into all these different collections. Kim, I mean, this is to Kim, although Farris, maybe you have an answer as well. And Kim, this is going to be one of these more nerdy, like technical questions. But I am curious. This is only something that, like, a scholar would ask, but I was fascinated by those color separations, which anyone who knows about the history of sort of printing and print culture knows that separations are actually important. Is there any indication anywhere that Hopper actually had a say or an involvement in the actual separations, or was that totally sort of done by others? Do we have any, I mean, are there any notations that would tell us, or do we not know at all?
Yeah, I think as soon as we found those, we began looking for precisely what you're asking, feeling like, oh, maybe there is something more to say here. And we had not previously thought that there really was any extant material that might have given any information about this. We did find there's one note that, that shows that he was issuing an approval, but of course you're wishing that it had something more specific, like more of this, less of this, or the contrast is too high. It has nothing, no specific detail, but it does show that he was being asked for his approval at one stage during that process. I wish we had more to say.
If I could jump in, because one of the things, I'm sure Clara's thinking this too, is that one of the things that's quite amazing in the Sendak collection at UCONN is all the color separations that Maurice did himself, and how so often he had to think in just, they're all in black and white, but he had to think about how the color was going to work. I think that's very interesting. Can I ask a question that's more to the sort of point of the whole symposium? Because I think one of the reasons why Hopper would seemingly be so ambivalent or anxious about his status as an illustrator, as you know, is the way in which the art world and modernism treated illustration, right? Illustration being less than. And this also brings together the Norman Rockwell part of it, because legendary in our world, there's a moment when Maurice was looking at the newspaper and was in a rage because the New York Times ran some kind of an article which had said, the question is, Norman Rockwell, was he merely an illustrator or was he an artist, right? You probably know that article well, right? So this whole question of status, but it's not just one of critics and art historians. I have to say today that it's an issue of museums, right? And I wonder, again, asking the Whitney, because this isn't off the record, but I've had discussions with people at the Whitney about Maurice Sendak, and they said, no way we'd have a show of Maurice Sendak at the Whitney. I know that the Museum of Modern Art doesn't really show illustration, right? Among all the things, they'll show a design of a beautiful toothbrush, but they think illustration is beneath it. Now, if illustration takes the form of a protest Grand Fury poster, it's okay. But if it's a children's book, then, forget it. So I wonder how, within your own institution, how are you working so that it's not just because Edward Hopper is a great painter, therefore we look at his illustrations, but how can we get rid of this whole idea? Matter of fact, maybe we shouldn't even have conferences about illustration. We should have conferences about artists, because these guys aren't illustrators, they're artists, right? That's what we need to advocate. That's what Maurice really wanted us to think about.
I know the question was to Farris and Kim, but could I just jump in for a moment?
Yes.
I mean, Jonathan, are you being a little bit, not naive in a way, but the historical evidence for me is that at least for a century, at least from the early 20th century, artists, but illustrators were they were so self-conscious about this question. Like anyone you look at who was really working in illustration, Rockwell, Hopper, Sloan, Sendak, they were aware of this problem. Even Ernie,
No, I'm not saying they're not aware of the problem. I'm saying that they are fighting against, Michelangelo is an illustrator. The Sistine Ceiling illustrates the Bible, right?
Right.
At some point, this dichotomy enters into the discourse, strangely enough, perhaps at the very moment of what you're calling the, mass media or something.
Yes.
It's about a mass media. But no, it's not to say that the museums are the ones at fault, but there's something strange about it. Like we need to go at it from so many different angles, I guess, which is, and also it's a very complicated issue. I know that we deal with it at the foundation. I'm sure they deal with it at the Norman Rockwell Museum. You don't want to say, oh, to be an illustrator is a great thing. I've always thought it was the greatest thing possible. So I don't mean to put down the word illustrator, but somehow also when you push the idea of illustration, you push the idea that illustrators somehow are not artists. It's very paradoxical. It's very difficult. It's a real conundrum. How to go at this problem, how to solve the problem, right, of this kind of marginalization. But it certainly is true, particularly of New York museums, that they have really perpetuated it, even though their collections, I mean, I'm sure the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art are full of spectacular examples of illustration. It's just that they don't show it.
Yeah, in fact, the Met has a bunch of those, what I think are wonderful early Duchamp illustrations, but they're hardly ever shown or seen because they're not considered significant, but they're really incredible images and drawing. So I don't know if Kim and Farris want to say anything about that or they want to sidestep it. I'm happy to jump in if you don't want to.
I'm happy to say a couple of things about it. I don't have any great, perfect, full answer, but I think that something that Jonathan, you and Michael were both just noting about, New York institutions. Certainly, as Michael said, the Met has really extensive illustration related material. And yes, one could say they don't show it because they don't believe that it is, fine art, but I think we could also just look at the size of a collection of the Mets and say that it hasn't been shown recently, but it could just very easily be shown next year, just as they've just shown their tremendous baseball card holdings. So I don't know that we want to put a judgment of quality or to say that they are, putting it into some separate category. I don't know that that's happening. And within the context of the Museum of Modern Art, for example, there is a lot of illustration material in the department that is now the Department of Drawings and Prints, but that was formerly the Department of Prints and Illustrated Books, where an entire portion of that collection was dedicated to of course, illustrations by artists like Picasso and Matisse. So maybe this is a little bit what you're saying, Jonathan, that is it that an illustration, I should say, can only goes into one of those institutions if it's an illustration by an artist who is first and foremost known as a fine artist.
Right, and also I'm being, the Museum of Modern Art has the art of the book in a kind of, or the manuscript there are different ways in which it can be sort of brought in, right? But by and large, Dr. Seuss is not going to be focused on, but if someone makes a limited edition, if Jasper Johns does, which is a wonderful thing, does Fizzles, and it is a beautiful limited edition printed book, then it's shown at the Museum of Modern Art, but it wouldn't be, a lot of the artists that we have seen today have not been shown at the Museum of Modern Art for various modernist reasons, right?
And Jonathan, Jonathan, you've known me for a very long time. I don't think anyone would think of me as a Pollyanna, but I'm going to be Pollyanna for a second and say, no, I do think that's why we need symposium conferences like the one last year in Washington University, this one today. I actually think there are a lot of people who are working on this, and that's the way these movements happen in any field. In the curatorial field, is people saying suddenly, at the Whitney, Barbara Haskell included Feininger printed illustrations in the Feininger show X number of years ago. Obviously, the Whitney's now working on this material. I am hopeful.
Right. No, and also it's a constant struggle. You have to go back and forth between these different modes. And of course, the way, I think this is a fantastic idea for Symposium, but just as, I think having a huge exhibition of children's illustration is a wonderful thing. But at the same time, it's always a trade-off in an interesting way into this struggle to take the work seriously and to see it in a as part of just art, right? And rather than
I will say too, like being Pollyanna-ish like Michael, I do feel now there's more of an interest in the expanded field of what is an artwork, in the sense of understanding what's around, the discrete work of art with a capital A, and really seeing process-based work, which includes the work of artists who were illustrators, and understanding the historical context of that. And I do feel that there's more of a desire from the public to really pull focus and really look what's around artistic practice as it's understood in the traditional museological sense for fine art museums. We see that in our exhibitions. Like if you go to the Vita show, there's, illustrations for publications in masses and cover illustrations of books that are actually on view right now. That's from the library's special collections. I had worked with Donna DeSalvo with the Warhol show to bring a lot of those special collection illustration materials. So I think there's more of a desire from the public and from curators to really look at it in the expanded field. I also do feel it's contextual. Again, it's like really, it's on a case-by-case basis with a particular artist and their sort of work in the historical context as well. So I think there's so many different sort of intersections and layers of how illustration brings meaning to the historical context of a particular moment, but also in the sense of the current moment where there's more interest in expanding that field of exhibition thinking and planning to really incorporate more of these materials. And I will tell you just anecdotally, we've been getting a lot more loan requests from library materials, whether they're books or magazines or single broadsides. So I'm noticing a significant uptick for interest in this, and I hope that continues.
Well, I want to thank everyone for a fascinating discussion. I think all these kinds of conversations, I think supporting scholarship in the field and all the work that you are doing is making that possible. So we so appreciate all the wonderful thought you're bringing to it. There was one person who's been trying to ask a question for a little bit, and I'd just like to see if Terry Brown would like to put his microphone on and make a final comment, and then we'll take a short break. Terry Brown, do you want to do that? We may have lost Terry.
Perfect.
Oh, here he is. Good.
I guess you are hearing me. I hope so.
Yes.
And I come up as my question. I hope you saw that. A lot of this has been really fascinating. I'm thrilled that you got big time traditional museums talking about the I word. I hope that all of us, and we are the choir, can keep in mind both the supply and the demand side. The supply side we're all talking about, and we love to find the stories of the suppliers. Let's also talk about those people who commissioned the work and what their needs were first, because they're the ones with the dollars, and what their desires were, and allowing artists to have some freedom to expand their chops and bring their specialty to the game. I really hope the Lucas Museum.
Terry? Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. Terry, I'm sorry we lost you, but for those of you who might not be aware, Terry was the director of the Society of Illustrators for more than 30 years and is extremely knowledgeable in the field. So thank you, Terry, for your comments.